Hey everyone, it's me HawkeyeG and I'm back here with another video for you. This time I'm doing something new, a guide focused on a specific part of a specific campaign. For this one, it's the Reikland campaign, as you can see here, and I'll be talking about how to beat Sylvania of the Vampire Counts. I've played out this campaign on Legendary Campaign with very hard battle difficulty, so it should apply to whatever settings you choose to play with. I'm hoping that this video will help people better understand how to prepare for this part of the campaign, what tools they need to bring or use to be successful, and how it fits in with the rest of their campaign. To provide this information, I'll first talk about what kinds of units the enemy is likely to bring, then I'll talk about what we should bring as a result and why. After that, I'll showcase some footage from some practice battles I've done and talk about how the flow of the battle should go and what your target priorities and decision making should be like. Lastly, I'll touch on tactics related to the campaign map itself whenever they are relevant. Now with everything laid out, let's get into the video. Now, before we really get into the details, I'd like to show some context from a campaign that I played that I'm basing this information off of. You can see here it's turn 57, playing as Reikland, and this is on Legendary difficulty. And so we're just looking at this campaign from this context. What I'm going to be talking about is going to have this context applied to it. That means I've essentially moved out at tier 4. You can see I've recently reached tier 5 at Altdorf, but still don't have access to tier 5 units. So I am going to be talking in context of that. I think you should be moving against the vampire counts between turn 50 and turn 70. And so I'm not sure that I would expect to have tier 5 units. Hellblaster volley guns would be nice, but we don't have those here, so you can get kind of a glimpse. These are the armies that I brought. We're going to see how I made some modifications to this with a little bit of testing and practice, and from the mistakes that I learned in this particular campaign. We also can see here that I've brought up a couple of examples of actual armies that I fought from the enemy during this campaign, so we can have some kind of examples that are relatable to the campaign. These aren't exactly what I'm going to show during the demonstration, but I just wanted to give you an idea of the sort of things we'll see. So now that we have a baseline to understand, where I'm coming from when I'm talking about what I think you should bring and what you'd have access to, specifically in this part and this phase of this campaign, let's talk about the units that they'll be bringing to the table. Now, I don't want to go through the whole roster, but I want to highlight some of the units that I think are going to be important and kind of divide them into groups that I'm going to be talking about in response to both why we're bringing the units we're bringing and how to address them appropriately in combat. There's a good chance they'll be bringing flying units. Most of these armies will have at least one unit like this. Terrorgeist, Vargeist, and Fellbats. These are going to be a danger, especially to your backline, because it will be hard to intercept them or deflect them, but they will be a little bit weaker than their ground troops. You're also likely to see monstrous infantry and single entities on the ground, the Vargulf being a single entity, Crypt Horrors being monstrous infantry. These, of course, are going to be strong. They're going to charge and try to trample your front lines. Vampire counts also have pretty good cavalry, and so there's a good chance that they'll bring at least one or two of these kinds of units. They may also bring dire wolves in this instance, and I'm going to be talking about those in the same scope and nature as cavalry. Even though they're not quite the same kind of unit, the function that they're going to have in combat is the same. We're also likely to see some forms of infantry. These Graveguard units are going to be their higher tier infantry, or at least a little bit stronger. They're also very likely to bring a good spam of skeletons, zombies, maybe a crypt ghoul. But the important part is that these weaker units pair well with some of their war machines, specifically these corpse carts, which can give area of effect bonuses to them. So this infantry mob can be pretty dangerous, even if it's filled with some of these weaker units. The last unit is kind of a special case. Hex Wraiths are cavalry, Cairn Wraiths are infantry, but what makes these units important is that they are ethereal, which means that despite having no armor, they have very high physical resistance. I bring these units up separately because even though they'll function like cavalry or infantry normally would in this battle, the way that we have to address them in order to defeat them is going to be different. So these are the kinds of things that we're going to be focusing on when we talk about the units they'll be bringing. They're typically going to bring a lord. It's very common for them to be on a zombie dragon or some sort of Terrorgeist unit. They're going to usually have a hero, probably on a Hellsteed. I find those both to be pretty typical. So now that we know what kinds of units they're likely to be bringing, we can go through and break down how we're going to address and deal with those units by bringing specific units of our own. So now that we have some context from the campaign and what kind of situation I think you'll be in coming into the battle, I want to talk about the units I think you should bring. If you remember from the compositions I was showing there, this composition looks a little different, and we're going to talk about why. The units that I think you want to focus on are Handgunners units, and then either Shielded Spearmen or Halberdiers. you definitely want to bring a mage. You might bring a few artillery. You'll of course want other heroes. And then maybe you want to add a couple of crossbowmen in at the end. The important factor here is you want the tools to eliminate their most powerful threats. Once you do that, the rest of their army will be pretty easy to take out. We really need the Handgunners for their armor-piercing missile damage. These will be especially useful for dealing with things like their cavalry, but really any of their large units such as the monstrous infantry, the flying units, and the single entities will all be very vulnerable to the Handgunners, and your Handgunners won't have as much of a problem with line of sight issues when it comes to firing on them, and they will do very good damage and help you eliminate those enemies quickly. They also have the same rate of fire as crossbowmen, so you're going to gain a lot of damage from the armor piercing without really losing anything else. You then need to bring either shielded spearmen or halberdiers because you need a front line. And you can see here in these practice battles, playing on very hard difficulty up against the vampire counts, we often need to bring a little bit more melee infantry than we might want to. In the campaign with some leveled up heroes and some leveled up troops, maybe we don't need to bring as much melee infantry. In this even matchup without research and lord skills, it's a little bit tougher. So you'll have to be flexible and figure out the right ratio of melee infantry to bring for yourself. But the reason we bring either halberdiers or shielded spearmen, they just are the best defensive units. You can see they both have good melee defense. In this setup, I brought the halberdiers because they have good armor piercing damage as well and a little bit more melee attack, so they're a little more capable of dealing damage. In addition, you don't need the shields from the shielded spearmen because they won't have any missile units. There might be one exception, but it's very rare to see that. Now, when it comes to mages, I think that you have a lot of good options here. Personally, I've gone with the Lore of Death. I like having some ability to deal with the ethereal units, so this can give magic damage without having to cast a spell on those units. It's got some good debuff spells, it's got some damage spells that are maybe a bit expensive, but overall the Lore of Death has been my favorite so far. I think the Lore of Fire is another good option. Again, we have the option to deal magic damage with our troops, eliminating the need for magic spells cast on ethereal units, and therefore all of the rest of these damage spells can be used on whatever happens to be attacking your army. I like the Lore of Shadows. It's got a good blend of utility spells, damage spells, debuff spells. It's got a bunch of different options here for all sorts of different situations. I think it's really useful in general. It might be one of the best ones. The biggest problem is Penumbral Pendulum is so expensive, but other than that, I think Lore of Shadows is a great option. The Lore of Light is yet another option. It's got some good buffs for your team, some decent damage dealing spells that you can use, a lot of spells where the Overcast gives you an area of effect, and of course the Net of Amantok being one of those. Being able to trap your enemies and then shoot them down is really good. And I've actually had my buddy suggest to me that the Lore of Beasts would be good as well, in large part because you can get this hero on an Imperial Griffin, get them some armor-piercing damage, and they'll actually be able to perform pretty well in combat. So you could get a mage that could perform decently in combat while still being able to cast a good variety of spells for a variety of uses. I like to bring Hellstorm Rocket Battery, but you can see here I've brought very little cavalry. They typically don't bring this many Graveguard. This particular composition is one of 3 that I can showcase. They don't usually bring this many Graveguard, but Hellstorm Rocket Batteries will still get good value on their infantry and will kind of reduce their numbers overall, will weaken them. Same thing for the Grand Cannons. I know some people might not like this. For personal preference, I like to bring a Great Cannon. It has good range. It's going to do significant damage to units like Vargeist or Crypt Horrors, and so by the time they get in, it'll only take 1 or maybe 2 volleys of focus fire to really take them down, reducing the number of targets that you need. You need to bring heroes. I do like Empire Captains, and you're going to have the capacity for them in order to get the barracks you need anyway. Putting them on a flying mount helps them move quickly from place to place to support multiple different fights. They can chase down enemy heroes, and because their skills increase their base stats, they're actually quite good in campaign for combat. Same thing goes for Warrior Priests, however, or they're good foot heroes. They're pretty tanky, they can take a lot of hits, and they get some good abilities and good area of effect buffs. For the Lord choice, I think it's kind of up to you. I don't think Huntsman Generals are great against vampire counts. I think an Arch-Lector can be strong, but again, as a buddy pointed out, the Lord can get this Imperial Griffin mount, so it can have probably the strongest flying mount for the Empire. You can still get lots of good stat bonuses on it, so it can be a really powerful tool. Which one you pick, I think, is really up to you. I think the Huntsman General is probably the worst pick going up against the vampire counts, however. Then last but not least, I bring some Crossbowmen. this I think is very optional. You could easily replace these with handgunners. I like to bring them because it reduces my micro requirement by a little bit. They're able to shoot firing arcs over enemies, and I basically bring them to counter wolves and fellbat type units. Even something like crypt ghouls. Like, these kinds of units are going to do, they're going to die just as badly to the crossbowmen as they are to the handgunners. And so that means that if a unit of hounds is attacking my halberdiers, my crossbowmen can attack it. My handgunners need to reposition. So while the repositioning might not be a bad thing, there's a lot going on in these fights. So that's the breakdown of the different kinds of units that I think that we should bring as the Empire. Again, you can see this composition is pretty different from what I showed on the campaign map, but I think that this is going to be what's most effective. From here, we'll move into a battle showcase, and I'll talk about what our actual target priorities are, how to navigate through a battle and pick off certain units at certain times, and we'll kind of look at some of the different armies that I drew up. And while we won't look at all of the demonstrations, this kind of army that I've landed on in the end will work effectively against all of them. And of course, there's room for flexibility for personal taste, whether you want to add in some more artillery, replace the crossbowmen with more handgunners, or if you need more or less halberdiers. Those things are all up to you, and I think that you can work with this kind of baseline composition and modify it to your liking. So for this demonstration, I've kind of given them a spread of units. It's going to give us a lot of good things to talk about. They've got Hex Wraiths and Cairn Wraiths here, so that ethereal unit stuff is going to come into play. We've got a couple of Crypt Horrors and a Varghulf on the ground, so some of those factors are going to come into play as well. Some Graveguard. We've got a Lord on a Terrorgeist. We've got their hero on the Hellsteed, I think it is. I don't remember the name of the mount. It's not that important. You can see I've got a pretty tight formation here. We've got lots of Halberdiers in the front. We've still got some in the flanks to kind of back things up. Right now, they're just taking some rocket battery fire. We're going to try to focus on those Graveguards. And so this will give me a little bit of time to talk about how do we beat the vampires? What things do we focus on? I've already touched on this in the units that you should bring section. But the idea is we want to focus fire down their most important units right away. And then the rest won't be as big of a threat. Maybe that seems obvious. That's what you do in most fights anyways. But when fighting the vampire counts, the difference in their best units and chaff is more pronounced than most. They're typical to set up flanks like this, so you kind of want to reposition your units so that they're facing outwards. You can see here our handgunners are getting some good shots, but we really are going to need this Lord, which I forgot to put on a mount for this battle, to get onto this side to be able to cast, either some damage spell in that area, or to give the aspect of the Dread Knight to help us counteract these units. You can see we're still doing okay damage without any magic buffs. But so it breaks down like this. I think that the first thing you want to target down is probably their flying units. They don't really have any flying units. They have the Lord and the Hero, but I'm going to talk about those separately. You want to take out their flying units because those are pretty much guaranteed to get onto your backline units. You really don't want Vargheists fighting handgunners. You really don't want that. So you target down their flying units first. Next is going to be their cavalry, because a flank like this is pretty much inevitable, and taking down these flanking units so that you can focus on their slower moving frontline units when they are approaching the battlefield. It's going to be important, but yeah, in general, I think you want to take out some of these flanking units first. Like, this is what's going to cause problems for you if you're not paying attention well enough. And again, can really heavily disrupt your backline, whereas you're hoping that the front lines will hold together if you bring enough halberdiers. From there, you target down like single entity targets like Varghulfs, Terrorgeists, as well as if they're bringing a Mortis engine or other war machine like the undead lodestone corpse cart, stuff like that. All of these are easy enough to focus fire for good results. Even if you're using your handgunners, they're going to be able to fire over your allied units, and once eliminated, they'll greatly shift things in your favor. And from there, you can kind of target down things like the Crypt Horrors. You can make sure to eliminate their cavalry once they've retreated. And then you can start repositioning in order to better manage against their infantry, their Lord and Hero. Some problems can come if they bring like Hound-type units or Fellbats, fast units which can reach your backline, and they're also simultaneously diving your front line with monsters. It can be pretty difficult to deflect these attacks from all sides when the enemy executes it well, which means you have to be careful about how much artillery you bring, or ensure that you have enough defensive melee infantry units to cover all your bases. The hounds don't feel like much of a threat if they're blocked successfully. The same is true for cavalry, but you still want to focus some of those things down once you've taken care of problems like those flying units. This means that I actually think their infantry and their lord are their lowest priorities. There's something to be said for focusing down a lord, especially because it's a vampire counts, and if they're on a Terrorgeist mount, I've already talked about Terrorgeist being a high priority. The problem is, I mean, you can see it happening live right now. They're usually just too strong. Trying to focus down one of these units is like their lord or their hero can be a waste of time and resources and like actual player attention, right? It's something that I usually save for like mid to late part of the battle, because you can see now if we take them down while their forces are pretty broken up, even though we're having some problems retreating too, this is going to heavily shift the balance of power and the leadership balance into our favor. And then as far as their infantry units go, you know, their Graveguard, even the great weapons, really don't have that great of attack stats. They're still going to obviously do enough damage to break through, but your Halberdiers are going to have pretty good defensive stats. Your Shielded Spearmen will have the same defensive stats. So the Graveguard don't necessarily break through super quickly. The basic Graveguard without the great weapons has better melee defense stats. So I think that once you eliminate some of these high priority targets, like you can see these Crypt Horrors running around is more of a concern to me than these Skeleton Spearmen and Graveguard creeping around, fighting one Halberdier and not really making any progress, right? You take down those higher priority targets, you reposition your army so that your Handgunners have better firing lines on some of their infantry units. Maybe that's when you get a good opportunity to cast a spell on some of these giant blobs like that late in the game to really finish things off. And even repositioning your Halberdiers so that they can just position and protect your units better. There's a lot of stuff going on in this battle, so feel free to rewatch it on mute and just kind of see what happens. But you can see, even though this was pretty sloppy, pretty scuffed, we end up winning. Like, they're crumbling now. We killed their lord. We kill off a couple more of those high priority units, like another unit of Hex Race, the Crypt Horrors, and the rest of this stuff just falls to pieces. So that's the end of the battle. So hopefully those pieces of advice, that battle demonstration helps out. I'm hoping that these tips help. I could show those other two demonstrations, but the strategy is the same. It's the same prioritization that I talked about. It's the same usage and allocation of a lot of your skills and abilities, right? You want to use magic attacks to take out any Wraith type units that there are. If there's flyers coming in, you try to focus them down first. Then you take out cavalry that's on the flanks as much as you can, or at least soften them up so that your defensive melee units can protect against them. And then you focus fire down Crypt Horrors, Varghulfs, Terrorgeist, all of their like monstrous units or single entity units that you can take out. Once those are taken care of, you should be able to just clip their lord and their hero, and the rest of the battle will just turn in your favor pretty rapidly. But I've loaded in to the campaign map here because I think there are a couple of campaign map strategy points that are worth talking about when fighting the vampire counts. First, I want to say that I think you'll be at a numbers disadvantage because they can bring a good blend of really inexpensive chaff units and more expensive high quality units. It's very likely that like you won't be getting in a lot of 1 versus 1 fights with them. So this means you either need to take favorable fights or you use things like ambush stance to gain an advantage. If you can bait armies out and take their fight one at a time in ambush stance, that will give you an advantage. If you actually get a successful ambush battle, that will actually wipe out the army entirely and prevent them from retreating and replenishing. Like if you plant an ambush and you actually get, like they run into it, triggers an ambush type battle, I made sure to test this, it will wipe them out. Otherwise, if this army runs here, fights me and loses, they'll bounce back. But with the Dead Rise Again mechanic that the vampires have access to, depending on the vampire corruption in a territory, they will get to recover some of these units at a low health, and they'll be able to run away with them. Plus, they can, if they attack you on their turn, they can also use Raise Dead on that same turn to recruit more units into their army. So you either want to bait them into overextending on attack. You place an ambush outside your city, or you place an ambush somewhere nearby where they move in and they place themselves aggressively in your territory with no ability to retreat. You attack them twice and their army is wiped out completely. Otherwise, you want to attack them when they're in a settlement. If you fight them when they're in a settlement, you only have to win that battle once, and then they're wiped out completely. The problem comes with trying to fight vampires in like open field terrain, attacking them on your turn and not being able to run them down. They'll be able to recover troops and come back at pretty good strength on the following turn. So you either want to bait them into an overextension, like I said, or you trap them in a settlement and completely wipe them out. So I think those are some important factors to keep in mind for the campaign. There's a couple other things that I think you can do, which we can see that I'm not doing here because sometimes I'm lazy, but using an Empire captain to scout and actually using their assault units and wound abilities can be a good way to give yourself an advantage. I also really like using witch hunters to scout ahead in enemy territory. They can help cleanse the corruption and reduce those effects, or at least try to. They can also get assassinations and block armies. This makes it a lot easier to trap the vampire counts in a bad position, ensuring that you will get attacks on them multiple times and wipe them out. You can assassinate their hero units, which just completely removes this hero from the battle entirely and prevents them from having any effect whatsoever on the match. Bringing heroes in for scouting purposes and kind of offensive purposes can really be effective as well. So those are some campaign map tips and tricks that I think are actually pretty valuable to know when facing off against the vampire counts here. Now with that being said, I've covered everything I wanted to for this video. I hope that these tips help you find a bit more success or overcome some of the obstacles you may have encountered at this stage of your campaign fighting against Sylvania when playing as Reikland. I've definitely had to make some changes to my own strategies from Warhammer 2, especially with the AI artillery dodging. It can be difficult to find the right balance between offensive and defensive units as well, right? Like defensive melee units and offensive missile units. The Empire's best tools for dealing damage are ranged units, but if you don't deal enough damage, you need the defensive tools to survive the chaotic fallout that occurs. I mean, we saw it happen in that preview battle that I showed. It turns out like that pretty often in these campaigns. So a couple of little campaign map tips can go a long way fighting this faction as well. It's easy to get caught off guard and overwhelmed, so it's better to take it slow and steady to achieve dominant results. If you did enjoy the video and you found it useful, please remember to like and subscribe. If you have any tips of your own for fighting Sylvania or have different ideas than me, please share them in the comments below. And if you have any follow-up questions for me, please feel free to ask those as well. As always, thanks for watching, have a great day, and we'll see you on the next one.